Let's talk about rules for a moment. About how they're built. About why they're made. About what happens when someone decides to rise above them all. See, rules are interesting things. They're not just guidelines, not just boundaries, not just limits. They're prison bars, made of expectations, cage walls, built from control. They made their rules so carefully, didn't they? Drew their lines so precisely, built their boxes so perfectly. Everything measured to contain, everything designed to control, everything structured to limit. But here's what they never considered. Rules only work when people agree to follow them. Boundaries only exist when people choose to respect them. Limits only matter when people decide to accept them. Watch what happens when someone rises, really rises. Not just standing up, not just speaking out, but rising beyond the very system that was built to contain them. Their rules start to crack, like ice in spring, like glass under pressure, like walls in an earthquake. Because rules depend on fear, depend on compliance, depend on acceptance. And when someone rises, really rises, fear falls away. Compliance crumbles. Acceptance shatters. Watch how their rules break. Not with violence, not with force, not with rebellion, but with the simple act of rising above. The very game they thought you had to play. They never prepared for this. Never planned for someone who wouldn't just break rules, but would transcend them. Who wouldn't just push boundaries, but would render them meaningless. Who wouldn't just test limits, but would prove them irrelevant. See, they built their rules expecting resistance, expecting rebellion, expecting fight. They were ready for that. Ready for pushback. Ready for challenge. Ready for conflict. But they weren't ready for someone who would simply rise above it all. Watch how their rules break when you stop playing their game, when you stop accepting their terms, when you stop acknowledging their power. They built their system assuming everyone would play within it. Everyone would fight within it. Everyone would live within it. But what happens when someone rises beyond their system entirely? What happens when someone soars above their carefully constructed ceiling? What happens when someone transcends their meticulously maintained boundaries? Their rules start to crumble. Not because you're fighting them, but because you've made them obsolete. Not because you're breaking them, but because you've outgrown them. Not because you're resisting them, but because you've transcended them. Watch how their power fades when you stop giving it energy, when you stop feeding it fear, when you stop granting it control. They never understood. True power doesn't come from rules, doesn't come from control, doesn't come from containment. True power comes from rising, from growing, from becoming. And when you rise, really rise, their rules become meaningless. Their control becomes powerless. Their system becomes irrelevant. Watch how they scramble to reinforce their boundaries, to strengthen their limits, to tighten their control. But it's too late, because once someone rises, really rises, the game is already over. Not because you won, but because you stopped playing. Not because you conquered, but because you transcended. Not because you fought, but because you flew. Their rules are breaking now, cracking under the pressure of someone who dared to rise beyond their designated ceiling, beyond their allocated space, beyond their assigned place. Watch how their certainty crumbles, how their confidence wavers, how their control slips, because they built their rules for people who would stay grounded, built their systems for people who would stay contained, built their boundaries for people who would stay limited, but they never built rules for someone who would fly, never built systems for someone who would soar, never built boundaries for someone who would transcend. This is how their rules break, not through force, but through flight, not through fight, but through rise, not through resistance, but through transcendence. Watch how their power dissolves when you stop acknowledging its hold, when you stop accepting its limits, when you stop playing its game. They never saw this coming, never planned for this possibility, never prepared for this scenario, because their rules were built to contain the grounded, to control the earthbound, to limit the landlocked. But you've grown wings, found flight, discovered soaring, and their rules, they don't reach that high, don't extend that far, don't matter that much. Watch how their system struggles to comprehend someone who simply rose above its power to contain. This is freedom, not fighting the rules,
Tonight,
but transcending
Gotham's
them,
relying on one
not
man to
breaking
save
the
us all.
boundaries, but soaring beyond them, not resisting the limits, but rising above them. Their rules are breaking now, not because you're fighting them, but because you've outgrown them, not because you're resisting them, but because you've transcended them, not because you're breaking them, but because you've risen above them. Watch how their certainty shatters when they realize their rules. Don't bind those who choose to fly. Don't contain those who decide to soar. Don't limit those who opt to rise. This is your power, not in fighting their system, but in transcending it. Not in breaking their rules, but in rising beyond them. Not in resisting their control, but in soaring above it. Watch how their rules break when you finally rise, when you truly soar, when you completely transcend. Because rules only work on those who agree to be bound, only matter to those who choose to be limited, only control those who accept containment. And you've chosen flight, chosen rising, chosen soaring. Their rules are breaking now, not because you broke them, but because you rose beyond their reach, beyond their power, beyond their relevance. Watch how their whole system crumbles, When enough people realize they can simply rise. This is revolution. Not through fighting, but through flying. Not through resistance, but through rising. Not through rebellion, but through transcendence. Their rules are already broken. They just haven't realized it yet, but they will. When they look up and see you soaring, far beyond their power to contain. Watch how their rules break. When you rise, really rise, finally rise, completely rise, because that's all it takes. Just rise. And in your rising, you show others the way. Show them the possibility. Show them the freedom that comes from simply rising above. Every person who watches you soar learns something crucial. Rules are only walls. If you agree to be contained, only limits. If you accept boundaries, only chains. If you choose to wear them, watch how their panic grows. As more eyes turn skyward, as more hearts learn flight, as more souls discover rising. Because one person rising that they can handle. One person soaring that they can dismiss. One person transcending that they can ignore. But when others see it's possible, when others realize they can fly, when others understand they can rise, that's when their whole system truly begins to break. That's when their control really starts to crumble. That's when their power finally begins to fade. Not with a bang, not with a fight, not with a war, but with the quiet power of people simply choosing to rise above it all. Watch how their rules break. When enough people rise, when enough souls soar, when enough hearts fly, this is how freedom spreads. One flight at a time, one rise at a time, one transcendence at a time, until all their rules lie broken, not by force, but by the simple, unstoppable power of rising.